Okay, so I have 3 handouts for today, so I'll just pass them down and pass them up. So when it gets to your end of your row,
Will there be pictures on the images?
Yes, there will be images.
Do you like our pictures?
Probably not hand-drawn pictures.
Well, if you're anything like me, that might be a good thing.
Yeah.
Yesterday, me and my kids were drawing whiteboard, and they're like, "Mom, draw a bird," and I'm like, is that like, it's supposed to be a.
Okay, so remember that the midterm, the lecture component is on Wednesday. And then that is just during the regular class period. And you have the review sheet for that, and we'll have some time to do review. That's what that blank sheet of paper is for. We're going to do some concept mapping. And then the lab practical is on Friday, and it will start at 11. So it won't start at 10. And so we're just going to do the lab practical, and then I'm going to give you some list of muscles, because that is what we're going to be talking about next.
So we don't need to be there until 11?
You don't have to be there till 11. Okay. So generally it only takes an hour to do the lab practical. Are there any questions before we get started? Well, if you think of one, yes.
Are we typically have quizzes at this time, but because of last week, so we're going to be making up this quiz, or?
I think will have enough time so that we'll still have quizzes on Wednesday.
Okay.
So we'll have a lecture. No, we'll still have it on Monday. Yeah. So yeah, we'll be able to make it up. Okay. And if not, I'll give you a homework assignment to make up for that quiz. And so your lab notebooks are due on Friday. I forgot to mention that. So after you take the lab exam, then you're going to turn in your lab notebooks.
But we can't use those during.
You can't use your lab notebook during the exam. Yeah.
Come on
now. Okay, so I mentioned before that this is a really nifty image, because it shows all of the, just a second. Oh, here we go. Shows all of the differences that we observe between the somatic division of the peripheral nervous system and the autonomic division, including the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And so if we look at what the designations are, I'm just going to we'll just label them so you don't need to look at your image, okay? So this is cells that are in the CNS, right? So remember, in the central nervous system, like the brain, like the spinal cord, we have cell bodies. And that is in the gray matter, because remember, it's the white matter that has the myelination. And so the cell bodies are gray matter. So this particular division is referred to as the somatic. Right, so the somatic is shown across in that particular row. And you'll notice that there are cells that are surrounding the axon. Can anybody tell me what type of glial cell is shown surrounding the axon? Those are called Schwann cells. Excellent. And they are actually what produces the myelination. So these are heavily myelinated. Okay, so what does that mean about the speed of conduction of the action potential? Is it faster or slower? Faster. It is faster. So you'll notice that when we get down here and we start to look at the autonomic nervous system, notice that they're either lightly myelinated or not myelinated at all. So the autonomic reflexes, like pupil dilation, would be slower than the somatic reflexes, like the tendon reflex or the stretch reflex. or the flexor reflex. Okay. Okay. So what is the spaces between the Schwann cells called? Nodes of Ranvier. And remember that these are actually named after people, so that Ranvier and Schwann does not have a meaning in terms of anatomy. So that is actually where the sodium channels are located. And so when we talk about the conduction of an action potential down a heavily myelinated neuron, remember that that action potential kind of jumps from node to node. And it's only in the nodes that we have the ion channels having to open and close in order to maintain the change in the membrane potential as that wave of depolarization moves down the axon. Okay. So this is showing skeletal muscle. And this positive means that it is excitatory. So that means that it is always going to cause a depolarization. So it is going to move the membrane potential towards the threshold. And remember, the threshold is about negative 55 millivolts. And once that threshold is reached, an action potential will be generated. So what type of neurotransmitter is being released between, this is an example of a motor neuron, actually all of these are, motor neuron, and its effector, which would be the skeletal muscle. What is the type of neurotransmitter? Acetylcholine. And remember that you can abbreviate that as ACH. So that's acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is a direct acting neurotransmitter, which means that it will bind to those sodium ion channels and open them up directly. So it is relatively fast, right? So it's a fast response, okay? So if we look at the autonomic, so this would be right here, this would be autonomic versus somatic. This is showing the two chains of neurons that are found in the autonomic nervous system. So remember that this is what we would call the sympathetic. So you could write that right here. So this is sympathetic. And this is parasympathetic. So its innervation is not on the skeletal muscle, but rather it's on the smooth muscle of the digestive tract, the heart, and then also glands. And so that's what this is showing here is that there are glands that are innervated by the autonomic nervous system, like the salivary glands, like the lacrimal glands that cause tears, right? The salivary glands producing saliva. Also, it affects the pancreas. The pancreas is a gland that could secrete enzymes or also the hormone insulin. Okay, so if we look at these right here, these are what are referred to as the pre-ganglionic neurons. Because what we see right here, here, and here, so this one, and this one, and this is the adrenal gland. This would be the ganglia. So remember that ganglia are always in the peripheral nervous system. They're not in the central nervous system. So the ganglia would be where we have nerve cell bodies located, and the adrenal gland is believed to be kind of a displaced ganglia, specifically the inside of the adrenal gland, which is called the adrenal medulla. And so after that, we have the postganglionic neuron. That's my postganglionic neuron. This is my preganglionic neuron. And then notice that we have what here, which would be what we call the effectors. Okay, so we say that the autonomic nervous system innervates the effectors, which would include the digestive gland, the pacemaker of the heart, the SA node, and also the glands, other glands in the body. So also skeletal muscles would also be effectors. Also notice here, we have no myelination, right? No myelination. So that means that it is slower. These are lightly myelinated, so I'll just put lightly. So the adrenal gland is showed as being connected to the circulatory system. So these are capillaries. So the adrenal gland produces a neurotransmitter, which also functions as a hormone. So hormones are long-acting versus short-acting, which neurotransmitters are. And so this is the circulatory system. So the neurotransmitter that's released by the sympathetic nervous system, which includes norepinephrine and epinephrine, two just slightly different forms of adrenaline, would be also not just neurotransmitters, but they could also be hormones, right? And that's what that is showing. So one of the things that you'll notice here is that all the preganglionic neurons are releasing ACH. So this is all ACH. Okay. So even in the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons always release acetylcholine, which is excitatory. And then it releases norepinephrine. So this would be NE. So this is NE, norepinephrine, NE. So NE is actually not, it's an indirect acting, so it doesn't act directly to open up ion channels, but it actually goes through the cyclic AMP. It kind of indirectly opens up those. So it's a little bit slower, but it is also longer acting because it is not as readily broken down as acetylcholine. So remember that acetylcholine, we have an enzyme called acetylcholine esterase, which will break down that acetylcholine really fast, but norepinephrine tends to stay in the synapse longer. And so this tends to be longer acting. So I'll put longer acting right there. And then this parasympathetic seems to be shorter acting. So you probably have all experienced this when you're asleep. And then the parasympathetic is overrode by the sympathetic nervous system when you have a bad dream. And so you wake up and you're like, whoa, like I just had a nightmare. And then it takes forever to get back, like you could be there laying there for an hour or two before you can get back to sleep. And that is because the sympathetic nervous system is longer acting, because norepinephrine is not as readily broken down. And it also gets into your circulatory system and acts as a hormone. So it stays in your body a lot longer. And that makes sense because you wouldn't want your parasympathetic nervous system to be long acting, because then you couldn't, under emergency situations, override it. So like if you're sitting at home and you are nice and relaxed, right? And somebody charges in through your front door, you don't want to just go, oh, right? You want to be able to jump up, right? And so that's why it is shorter acting, right? And you know, people have problems with their adrenal glands. They can get cancer in them, right? And then sometimes you have to have them removed. And then if you can imagine, a person with that kind would always be in a really because they don't have adrenaline being released by their adrenal glands. And so they tend to not respond as readily as somebody who would have adrenal glands that are acting properly. Okay, so are there any questions about this overview of the somatic and autonomic nervous systems? Nope. Okay. So we were talking about the cholinergic versus adrenergic fibers. And remember that fiber is just another way to say axon. So a fiber is an axon, but we also have adrenergic receptors and cholinergic receptors. So we're going to start with the cholinergic receptors. Okay. So these are actually found on the cell bodies or the dendrites because they will bind, these are the receptors that actually bind acetylcholine, right? So these are the receptors that bind ACH. And these receptors come in two different forms. So we can have nicotinic receptors. So nicotinic receptors are one type of cholinergic receptor. They're named because they also bind nicotine. So we discovered how nicotine, which is in tobacco, binds and how it affects the nervous system. And so nicotine binds to these cholinergic receptors. And so these nicotinic receptors are on all skeletal muscles. Right? So those receptors that bind acetylcholine and cause the skeletal muscle to contract would be nicotinic. And all postganglionic neurons, because remember, acetylcholine is released into the synapse by the preganglionic neuron. So the postganglionic neurons would have receptors. So if we go back to our diagram, right? So this is the preganglionic neuron. It is releasing ACH, but the postganglionic neuron would have nicotinic receptors that bind the acetylcholine, right? So that, in this particular instance, this is always excitatory, right? So I'll actually put up here, always excitatory. So when ACH binds to a nicotinic receptor, it's always going to cause an action potential to increase the likelihood that an action potential will be produced. Okay, and then all the effectors of the parasympathetic division, right? So everything that the parasympathetic would scratch it off. Okay, sorry, I was ahead of myself. Okay, so the muscarinic receptors. Okay, so there's two different types of cholinergic receptors, the nicotinic and the muscarinic. So these are on the effectors of the parasympathetic, parasympathetic. Okay. And so these could be excitatory or inhibitory. Okay, so those are muscarinic. So these are named after toxins that, in one case, the tobacco plant produces to prevent them being eaten by organisms. And so nicotine actually causes the heart rate to increase When people say that it relaxes them, nicotine actually increases metabolism and kind of speeds up the heart. I'm not sure why people say that smoking relaxes them, because it actually increases blood pressure and increases heart rate.
Is that why when somebody quits a tobacco product, they usually need?
Probably, yeah. And plus they are eating instead of smoking. Yeah. It's like a chew gum instead of smoke or eating. Yeah. So the muscarinic receptors are named after a muscarine, which is a toxin produced by a fungus, so a mushroom in particular. And so that's why it has this name. So those are muscarinic receptors. And so there are different drugs that affect so that they can mimic acetylcholine or norepinephrine. And so I've given you a handout that you can do in a little bit. We'll do the review first, and then if you have time, we can go over that. That has the tables on the front and then questions on the back about the different drugs that affect that. Okay, so these are cholinergic receptors. We also have adrenergic receptors. So these are receptors that bind norepinephrine. So they bind norepinephrine, or NE. And they don't have nearly as interesting of a names. So what they did is they gave them Greek letters. And so we have alpha. And alpha is written kind of like that. So we have alpha 1 and we have alpha 2. And then we have beta. And these would be beta 1, beta 2. It's a kind of a funny looking bee, kind of with a little tail there, and beta 3. So these could either have excitatory or inhibitory, depending upon where they are located, right? So they can be excitatory or inhibitory. So for example, if we look at alpha 1, one of the effects that it has, and this is also in the table, do you guys have extra copies of that? So I can kind of point to it, what it looks like. Okay, so in this autonomic nervous system, if you look at the adrenergic receptors, okay, and it says alpha 1. So this is serves the blood vessels, and so alpha 1 receptors would be on the smooth blood muscle of the blood vessels. So when these blood vessels bind norepinephrine, then this causes vasoconstriction. Right? So if you have anaphylactic shock, which is due to leaking of fluid from your blood vessels due to an allergic reaction where the fluid will leave the blood and it'll cause really abnormally low blood pressure, and this could cause you to faint or go into a coma or even to die. One of the things that they do is that they give you epinephrine, right? So you would use, for example, an EpiPen. Right. So they always recommend that if you are a new parent, that you have an EpiPen on, just on hand, just in case, because you never know what your children are going to be allergic to. But there was a kind of a lot of controversy about these EpiPens because they shouldn't be really expensive to make. But yeah, but if you don't have insurance, how much are they? $600. With insurance, it's like $150. Yeah.
No, that's with insurance.
600?
After insurance.
Oh, really?
$600 because my daughter is allergic to eggs, peanuts, and
Wow.
I have to carry 2 EpiPens on me at all times,
Right.
plus Benadryl.
So what this does is the epinephrine goes in there and it would bind to these alpha-1 receptors and cause vasoconstriction. So this boosts the blood pressure so that the blood pressure can get to the brain and keep the brain alive, right? So this boosts blood pressure. I think the last time I got one with my insurance must be a little bit different, but I think that they just, didn't the guy just like make it like 600 a minute used to be or something like that, whoever was manufacturing it.
Mhm.
Anyway, mine was 150, I think, with
I go to
insurance.
Mexico now and get them.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I really do.
Yeah.
And they're about $20 a pen.
Oh, really? Wow. Yeah. Okay, so then if you look at beta 1,
Is epi addictive, I guess you could say? Like,
well, it causes the same kind of thing as, so when you look at the methamphetamines, they cause norepinephrine to be released by cells in your brain. And so that's why it also boosts your heart rate. So when you take methamphetamines, you stay awake, right? And you can become really productive. And I think that's probably why it became so addictive in the first place, is people were using it so they could work through shifts. And so, yes, so I guess if you were to use epinephrine on a regular basis, like an EpiPen, that would give you like a shot of adrenaline, which could be addictive. Yes.
yeah.
It could also kill you.
Yes, it could also kill you probably.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, epi in all schemes of things is really just adrenaline. So that's kind of why I was wondering if it's addictive as far as the brain, not necessarily consciously like, oh, yeah, I'm just going to keep stabbing myself with this pen.
Right.
But for the, like how nicotine is addictive.
Yes.
Saying.
Yes. I don't know if that is a source of, since they're so expensive, probably not a source
Yeah.
of drug use by young children or by young adults. Okay. So let's look at beta 1. So notice that this one is what is found on the heart. So this would be cardiac muscle. And this increases the heart rate. So there is a drug that is referred to as a beta blocker. So for example, if you have tachycardia, if your heart is speeding up for whatever reason, so it could be that you have atrial fibrillation, which also seems to go along with having a rapid heart rate. So if your heart rate is up to like 200, right, that's a really bad thing. And so sometimes they'll give people beta blockers. And what this does is this blocks the receptors on the heart so they can't bind adrenaline. But what this means is that under certain circumstances, you might feel like you can't get your heart rate up to the level that it needs to be. So for example, you could be on a beta blocker and not be able to finish a flight of stairs because you have to stop because your heart is not keeping up with the demands of the body. And so beta blockers are useful for decreasing heart rate in people that have excessively high heart rates. And this table says the drug name is propanolol. Right, so this is propanolol is the drug name of a common beta blocker. Okay, so there's another drug here that's used very often in people that have asthma. So you'll notice here that when we look at the asthma, one of the things that it does is it causes constriction of the bronchioles. So what this does, if you take albuterol, which is a steroid, this actually binds to beta 2 receptors. And these are in the lungs. And what these do is that these relax and dilate the pathways into the lungs, so they make breathing easier. So beta 2 on lungs, right? And so albuterol binds and causes dilation of what we'll call the bronchioles. So this makes breathing more easy. So it kind of opens up the lungs. So when you see people that like maybe are on an athletic field and they're exercising and they're using their inhaler, this is what the inhaler is doing. So it is mimicking the epinephrine because it's going to cause the lungs to open up so that the lungs can take in more oxygen. And asthma can be caused by an allergic response to an allergen, but it also could just be stimulated by exercise. It can be stimulated by cold air. Other things can cause those allergic reactions to happen as well. So another really common one in here, you'll notice, is the phenylephrine. So what's that? That is a nasal decongestant. Right? So this actually binds, this mimics, and it binds to the receptors, and it causes constriction of blood vessels. So why would constriction of blood vessels decrease inflammation? Less blood flow, right? So when you have an allergic reaction, so let's say you're congested, so the lining of your respiratory tract is swollen. And it's swollen because there's dilation in the blood vessels and fluid is leaving those capillaries and entering into the tissues. So nasal decongestants can bind to those alpha receptors and can decrease that blood flow. And so that would decrease inflammation. And so you could take that. So those would be like Sudafed. So it's not an antihistamine, but it would be like Sudafed. And you remember that Sudafed, now you have to get a prescription for it. You can get the Sudafed over the counter, but to get the red pills, you have to have a prescription because they were used as precursors to making methamphetamines.
So didn't it used to be available over the counter?
Yes.
Which is right, because my mom
Yes.
used to be able to get it.
Yes, and so people were going and they were buying huge quantities of it. And so some states you can still buy them over the counter, but they keep track of how many you are buying.
And I think you can buy them behind the counter. I think some of the pharmacies has it. I don't know.
I think in Oregon you actually have to have a prescription for it, but in
I
Idaho,
think that's the case. I think in Utah you can.
yeah, in other states you can buy it, but it's behind the counter.
It's just like iodine, they make you sign a piece of paper to buy iodine and they keep track of how much you buy.
Is that for, what is that for?
Iodine.
Is that for also for making methamphetamine? Okay, so this is why those receptors are kind of important medically, right, to understand them because of binding of the neurotransmitter to them on the effectors can be mimicked or they can be inhibited depending upon, you can design drugs that can be used to treat different symptoms based upon whether they're going to mimic the effect of the neurotransmitter or whether they're going to block the effect of the neurotransmitter. Okay, so we're going to switch topics here. And so if you could get out your sheet of paper, and I would recommend when we start this is going to get filled up really fast. So I would recommend writing kind of small. I know some of you write really big, but if you can kind of write small, you don't have to write tiny, 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 but it's just useful because these are very big pieces of paper, if you write rather small. Okay, so if you look at the list of topics on your review sheet, right? If you look down at them, this all pertains to the nervous system. So we've just spent half a quarter on the nervous system, right? So the next half of the quarter is going to be on skeletal muscles, and it's going to be on the endocrine system. So we're going to write right in kind of in the middle, the nervous system. I do have do you have?
She got one.
Okay. Does anybody need an extra review sheet? I have one extra. Okay, so the first thing that we talked about was nervous tissue. So remember that nervous tissue is a group of cells that kind of have a common structure and function. And there's two parts anatomically to the nervous tissue. So we have we have the neurons, and then we have the glial cells. And remember that there are 6 types of glial cells, 4 of which are only found in the central nervous system, and 2 are found in the peripheral nervous system. So we talked about the anatomy of the nervous system, but we also talked about the physiology. Right? So that's the mechanism of action. So we could talk about the cell body, the axons, the dendrites, but really what we want to find out is how the neurons work. Right? And so when we talk about the physiology, what is a word that might come to your mind when we're talking about the physiology of neurons? That's the anatomy. Axons are anatomy.
The propagation of action.
Yes, right? So we have the propagation, excellent word, of action potentials. So they communicate, right? Neurons, what they do is they communicate very well between each other, but also they communicate to the central nervous system via sensory neurons, and then out to the muscles and the glands and the rest of the body via motor neurons, right? And so this is the mode of communication. So I'll put communication here. Okay, so what is an action potential?
All or none.
It's all or none. Is it positive or negative? Positive. So it tends to be what? A positive 30 millivolts, right? It is all or none. And it moves, right? So it is a temporary change in the membrane potential as it moves like a wave, which is called the propagation, or as it jumps between node to node. So this would be temporary change in the membrane potential. So we have sensory neurons. What is an example of a sensory neuron? Touch, right? So for example, we have tactile receptors on the surface of the skin. So the sensory neurons are part of the PNS, right? PNS, they're out in the body. That's a P. They're not part of the central nervous system, right? And so they are actually taking an action potential, producing an action potential, taking it, a stimulus, and transducing it into an action potential. So these are actually examples of mechanoreceptors that transduce mechanical energy into an action potential. so I believe that this is actually one of your essay questions. So if you look on your review sheet. Oh, did I take it off of here? Maybe I took this one off. Sorry, I thought there was one on here. Oh, wait a minute. Here it is. Okay. So what is an action potential? We just wrote that down, right? And then how does the central nervous system consciously distinguish between touch on the arm and one on the foot? So where is this tactile receptor going to, how is it going to send, how is it going to transmit the action potential into the central nervous system? It's going to first go into the spinal cord, right? Just because the arm and the foot, or the, yes, so the arm and the foot are both connected to the spinal cord. It's not, if it was on the face, it would actually go right to the brain, right? Because those are cranial nerves. So these are spinal nerves. And remember that it goes into the spinal cord, and then it goes to an ascending tract. So it moves up, right? And then it goes into the thalamus. And where do we consciously perceive action potentials? In the cerebral cortex. And where? What specific part of the cerebral cortex is responsible for touch? Anybody remember? Body. What is a word for body? Somato, right? So soma. So yes, somatosensory cortex. Right? So the cortex, this is the only conscious part of our brain. So it's got to go to the somatosensory cortex. And remember that there's a little homunculi, little human, right? It maps itself. So if it's from the foot, it's going to go to a different part of the somatosensory cortex. It's wired, right, than it is from the arm. And so that is how you are consciously able to perceive the difference in touch. And we talked specifically, you wouldn't have to add this to this. This is more than you would need to know for the essay. But remember, we talked specifically which routes do the sensory neurons take into the spinal cord? Yeah. Dorsal or ventral? Dorsal, right? So this is the dorsal route. So I'll just put dorsal route into the spinal cord. The ventral routes are motor neurons. That's why when you get polio, which destroys the ventral root neurons, you get paralysis. You might still be able to sense things, but you would be paralyzed. Okay, so that goes in through the dorsal root. Okay. So we also have organization, right? So when we talk about the nervous system, we could put over here organization. So we could talk about the CNS, the central nervous system, and it has two components, which would be what? What are the two parts of the central nervous system? Brain and spinal cord. What protects the brain and the spinal cord from damage? The skull and the CSF does, but the vertebrae. So the skull and the vertebrae are the bony protections, right? And then we have the meninges. So we only have the meninges in the CNS, right? The nerves also have connective tissue wrapped around them, but they don't have the meninges. And so how many layers do we have in the meninges? 3, right? And so the outermost layer is the dura mater. Then we have the arachnoid mater. So this would be like the anatomy, right? And then you have the soft mother, or the kind mother, or the gentle mother, which is the innermost layer. Okay. So where does the CSF reside in the meninges, in the meningeal layers? Arachnoid, and specifically subarachnoid, right? So it is filled with the cerebral spinal fluid, and this actually helps to cushion the brain, right? Our brain is fluid filled on the inside and also has this cerebral spinal fluid. And it also kind of bathes it in ions. There's neurotransmitters in there, right? So it also kind of helps with providing nutrients and things that the neurons need. Okay? And it is in the ventricles of the brain, but it is also in the central canal of the vertebrae. So can you give me something that is related to CSF? What is something that you learned that is related to this cerebral spinal fluid? It's replaced, so it circulates, right? So it's produced, and what is it produced by? Does anybody remember? Yes. So we have the choroid plexus. That's an I, choroid plexus. And how is it reabsorbed? This is a weird one. Arachnoid granulations. They used to be called villi, and then they changed the name on me. I don't like granulations very well. Okay. And the arachnoid granulations actually put it into the subdural space, where then it is taken back up by the circulation, right? So it goes back into the venous circulation. So it's produced from blood. The choroid plexus has the capillaries. The arachnoid granulations deliver it to the dural sinuses, where then it goes back into circulation. Anything else related to the organization of the brain? Functional anatomy. So what is the 80% of the brain is what called what? So most of your brain is the 80% by mass. The cerebrum, which is not the cerebellum. It's kind of easy to get those confused, right? So we have the cerebrum. It's like 80% of mass of brain. It's huge. It's not so huge in other organisms. So even when we looked at the sheep, we had, parts of the brain like the cerebellum wasn't that small compared to the cerebrum, but when we look at the human brain, that is the mass, okay? And remember that it has gray matter with 2 T's and white matter. So the gray matter is on the outside in the cerebrum, and it's the opposite in the spinal cord where it's on the inside. And then the white matter is on the inside. And so the white matter in the brain would not be nerves, it would be what? Tracks. All right? So bundles of myelinated neurons in the cerebrum are called tracks in the central nervous system. So even in the spine or cord, it's called a tract, right? So these are in the CNS. Right, CNS tracks. Okay. So what is the tracks that connect two of the two cerebral hemispheres together? Commissural tracks. Oops, how do I spell commissural? Commissural, I think that's with one M and two S's. But that means that they connect. And so that is also called the corpus callosum. Right? We also have association tracks, right? And so that would be like in one hemisphere, like I see something, and then action potentials from my primary visual cortex have to be transported to my association visual cortex so that I can make sense of what I am seeing, right? So those association tracks are important. And then there are also pyramidal tracks. These have another name. They're called corticospinal tracts. Right? And so they transmit action potentials from the cortex down into the spine, specifically from the motor cortex. So all the action potentials that are produced in the motor cortex have to be passed down. They could be passed out to the face, which allows us to move our tongue and make facial expressions. But then they also go out to the spine and then leave the spine and go out to the muscles. So they synapse and then come out and into the nerves in the peripheral nerve system. So we have functional anatomy. So we also have, besides the cerebellum, we have a part of the brain that is called the Diencephalon. And this is actually an embryonic designation. So we have embryonic anatomy. So we have the telencephalon and then the diencephalon. So the cerebrum is actually the telencephalon. But there's three parts to the diencephalon. Do you remember what those are? They're all related to the thalamus, right? So yes, so we have the thalamus as being the biggest part. Right? And then we have the hypothalamus. And then we have the epithalamus, which is also called the pineal gland. So the diencephalon is much smaller than the telencephalon, it's the cerebrum. Okay, so if we look at number 4 on your essay. So a friend tells you about an upsetting incident where they immediately have an emotional and sexual response to something that they, upon reflection, deem inappropriate. So remember that we have emotional reflexes. And remember that there's a whole group of structures inside the brain that are responsible for these emotional reflexes. And what is that group? It's called a system. It's called the limbic system. Right. So we could see a snake and we could have a fear response that would be hard to override, you know, because it could scare us. But then we're like, oh, well, that snake, I didn't even, you know, it's in a cage, right? It's not going to hurt me. And so you could override that. But the same thing with sexual reflexes. So remember that we have visual stimuli. And all stimuli goes where? All stimuli has to go through what structure before it can be perceived, consciously perceived? Thalamus. That's the relay center. And then from the thalamus, it could go to the hypothalamus. And remember that this is fast and it is unconscious. The slower route takes us to the cerebral cortex. Right? So that's the slower route. So the hypothalamus could stimulate a sexual reflex where you might feel sexual arousal. Right? Right? And then you feel ashamed. But if you realize that this is simply a built-in reflex, like fear or anger, then you can override that with your cerebral cortex. You go, oh, that is just the way my body is wired, right? It doesn't mean that I have to, that I'm abnormal or that I have to act upon any of the stimuli that I don't want to. So that is just an example of an emotional reflex. Okay. So this is the CNS. So I put CNS up here, right? My organization, my CNS. So I'm going to put PNS down here somewhere. So I'll put it over, put it down here, PNS. Okay. So we talked a great deal about the peripheral nervous system today, but remember that it contains the somatic, the sensory, and the autonomic. So remember, instead of tracts, we have nerves. Right? So we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. And some of those are totally sensory. So the olfactory nerves are sensory. The optic nerves are totally sensory. Some of those are totally motor. So the ocular motor nerves that control the movement of the eye are totally motor. But then some of them are sensory and motor. So for like, for example, the trigeminal nerve, which is a big nerve, it has sensation, which allows you to sense your teeth, right? When you want to numb that, but it also has the ability to move some of the face. And so some of those nerves are mixed. And then how many spinal nerves do we have? 31 pairs of spinal nerves, right? Are those all sensory, all motor, or are they all mixed? All mixed. And that's because the spinal nerves are formed when the dorsal root and the ventral root come together. So the motor neurons that are sending action potentials out, the sensory neurons that are sending action potentials in, they come together and make up that nerve. And it's kind of interesting because action potentials are being transmitted in opposite directions, right? Because they're being transmitted from one neuron to the next. And they only travel from the cell body to out through the axon, where they then cause neurotransmitters to be released. Okay, so let's look at another essay question. Okay, so in the somatic nervous system, we have, and actually autonomic as well, we have spinal reflexes. So these are somatic. Reflexes do not require the central nervous system to be involved, right? So it is just the sensory information goes in to the spinal cord and out from the spinal cord. And it's a fast response, right? So these are fast and they're integrated by the spinal cord only. So I'll put not the brain. Okay. So sensory information comes in the dorsal route. And in some cases, you have an interneuron. And so we can talk about spinal reflexes being polysynaptic or monosynaptic. So if they're polysynaptic, then they have interneurons. We can also talk about them being ipsilateral, lateral, contralateral, or what is it if they're on the both sides? Consensual. So ipsilateral means that it's on the same side. So when I stretch my muscles and the reflex is to cause them to contract to keep them at proper length, that would be ipsilateral. The only example of the contralateral that we had was that the reflex, which is called the cross extensor. So if I step on something and it's sharp and I pull my foot away, it's going to cause my other foot to extend. Or once you go to fall, so like if you're on a skateboard or something, or if you trip, it's going to cause the other foot to respond so that you can catch yourself before you fall. And one thing that's consensual would be the pupillary reflexes. Those aren't spinal reflexes, those are autonomic cranial reflexes, but if you stimulate one eye, it generally affects the other one as well. Okay.
Can brain damage cause only one pupil strict, or is that
it could be a nerve damage too, and also drugs, like if they put in a dilator, that is going to affect the to dilate your pupils would affect the sympathetic nervous system. So that would be probably bind to an adrenergic receptor, which causes your eyes to dilate. Yep. Okay, so that when the stretch reflex causes the muscle to contract, but what does the tendon reflex cause?
What's the word under monosynaptics?
Ipsilateral.
Oh,
Contralateral, consensual. Yeah, ipsilateral. Okay. Okay, is there anything else on here that when you look at these essay questions, you're like, I would like to know more about?
What you were just talking about.
Okay. Okay. So if we look at the stretch reflex, the stretch reflex, the receptor would be the muscle spindle fibers. Oops, spindle, muscle spindle. We'll just put muscle spindle receptors. And they're called muscle spindles because they are just modified skeletal muscle fibers. And they are shaped like a spindle. They're big in the middle and narrow at two ends. So when those muscle spindles are stretched, and action potentials get sent into the spinal cord. And so this tells your body that your muscle is being stretched too much. And so the response is that the muscle will contract. Okay? So stretching causes increase of action potentials. So I'll just put AP, moving into the spinal cord. This is monosynaptic. The muscle responds when a motor neuron sends a signal out to it. Oh, muscle responds by contracting. And this keeps the muscle at the proper length. So you don't want your muscles to be all stretched out, because when they're all stretched out and you try to contract them, they're not going to be able to contract very forcefully. There's actually an optimal length to your muscles. You don't want them, you know, sometimes bodybuilders get muscle bound. So their muscles are so big and contracted, and they stay contracted and they don't relax, that they actually are not able to lift very much because their muscles are too contracted.
Is that why like contortionists, are they like missing that?
They have extra flexible tendons. They can hyperextend their joints because their tendons are long and stretchy.
But you can train yourself to do it. Like your body to get to that point, or do they
I think-
naturally have to do it?
Oh, no. It's not good. It's not good.
It doesn't.
It's really cool in yoga class, but actually, if you are able to hyperextend a joint, it can actually damage the joint. And so there is a disease called Ehlers-Danlos, which some people have when they have really and so they can actually pop their arm, my daughter can take her femur and pop it out of her hip and put it back in. I'm like, no, don't do that. Her patella floats over her kneecap. She can take her patella and it just like, right? And that means that those tendons are not stabilizing your knee. And so your knee, and so so she trips, and if she hyperextends her knee, it will swell up. So she's just walking along and she'll hyperextend her knee, and then it'll end up being all swollen, right? And so, so it can be a really bad thing. So she actually is supposed to be, she doesn't do it, but she's supposed to be doing exercises that strengthen the muscles to help stabilize her joints. Yeah. Hoping she'll grow out of it. That's what I'm hoping. Okay. So this is different than the tendon reflex. So you have proprioceptors in your tendons. So it's a receptor in tendon. It detects tendon stretch. Your tendons do not stretch as easily as muscle, and if they do become stretched, they can become damaged. So when you sprain a joint, for example, oftentimes you have stretched the tendon and you might have ripped a tendon. And so it takes a long time for them to repair. So if the tendon is being stretched too much, the response is that the muscle relaxes. Right? And this protects the tendon. It doesn't keep the muscle at its proper length, but it helps to protect the tendon.
I have a question. So is that like when somebody falls and you hear that, like, it's like I fell and I had my foot clear here and my muscles never got hurt, but I tore my ACL and my PCL. Is that what happened? Was it the response was just to let the muscle stretch to protect everything, even though it didn't work?
Yeah, so hopefully your body responded, but if it's too dramatic of a fall, then the tendons will just rip, right? And then they don't repair themselves. The ligaments really don't. So those are actually cruciate ligaments. The ligaments don't repair themselves hardly at all. So you actually have to go in and have this repaired. Right? But this would be like, you hyperextend your knee for some reason, and then for the next week or two, your knee feels unstable. So you just kind of keep like tweaking it. You're like, I keep tweaking my knee, and that's because you've stretched the tendon, right? And so the tendon isn't stabilizing the joint as it should.
Yeah, I think I've had that happen before when I was playing tennis. I did a lot, like my knees, like I almost couldn't even like.
Yeah, so that's why when you exercise, then you have to wear a brace.
Yeah.
But they don't want you wearing braces all the time because then that will make the muscles weaker. So only when you're at risk of damaging it. So this would be an example of a polysynaptic reflex. And both of these would be ipsilateral. So it's on the same side. They're not contralateral, they're only ipsilateral. So the stimulus is on the same side as the response. Okay. So we've run out of time, but there's something that you need to cross off.
Keep going. I still have a battery. Keep going.
So look at neuropathy. You can cross that off. That would be like diabetes causes neuropathy, which means that there's damage to the nerves, which we'll talk about that when we get to the endocrine system. And then the enteric nervous system is really interesting because it is what innervates your digestive tract. So it's called your second brain. So neuropathy and enteric nervous system can be crossed off. Is there anything else on this that you think we didn't go over, or have you had a chance to look at it, hopefully?
On the list, it shows cranial nerves, number and function.
Oh,
So I'm not sure, like,
I just put it in there.
okay.
Yeah.
Oh, so it's just,
It's the same thing.
I had a question. When it was talking about the, oh my gosh. The physiological withdrawals from heroin, what exactly is it?
Okay, so physiological withdrawals from drugs. That's when your neurotransmitters are, like, for example, endorphins in that case. When you're on heroin, your body senses that you have too much endorphin in your body. And endorphins are the pain, natural endogenous morphine. They relieve pain. And so once you go off heroin, then you don't have enough. And it takes a while for your body to start producing more. So with the withdrawal is that you have abnormally low endorphins, which makes withdrawal from heroin extremely painful, which is why people have such a hard time coming off of heroin. So that's why they give them methadone, which is oral, pill, or liquid, instead of having them use needles, which could allow them to contract HIV or hepatitis.
Or go back to heroin.
Or go back.
Or go to some needles.
Yeah. Yep.
That's typically weaned off like by doctors.
Because if you take somebody off of that too quick, can't their brain like just totally shut down?
Yeah, and I don't know what they do for babies because, you know, babies can be born addicted to heroin.
They just have this.
Yeah, I don't know if they try to give them a little bit so that they're not, or they just let them. They do.
So, yeah, they put them into like almost a comatose state so that their brain is not damage itself and they shut down all the chakras.
Now, why wouldn't like a blood transfusion fix that for babies? You know?
Because it's in the nervous system.
Oh.
So it's moved out of the blood and it's now in the nervous system.
Here's your pen back, or pencil back. Thank you very much. I definitely erased